Hosting our guest today is Becky Norton Dunlop, Vice President for External Relations here at Heritage. Mrs. Dunlop oversees Heritage's strategic outreach and communication, both nationally and internationally, to conservative public policy organizations, other leadership groups, as well as policy activists. Prior to joining Heritage in 1998, she served as Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia in the cabinet of Governor George Allen. She has also served significant roles in the Reagan administration as Deputy Assistant to the President for Presidential Personnel, Special Assistant to the President and Director of the Cabinet Affairs Office, Senior Special Assistant to Attorney General Edwin Meese, as well as Deputy Undersecretary of the Department of the Interior. She currently serves as a member of several boards on numerous public policy organizations and associations dedicated to advancing our conservative principles. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Becky Norton Dunlop. Becky?
Thank you so much, John, and let me add my words of welcome to those of you who are here with us in the auditorium and those of you who are watching this online or in the future. We are delighted to be able to have this program here at the Heritage Foundation today. Heritage obviously focuses a lot of its public policy interests and concerns and research on policy issues that are advanced here in the United States of America. But there's no question about the fact that we live in a world, a big world and an important world, and so we're concerned about lots of the same key principles that guide our thinking here in the United States of America as it relates to the rest of the world. And the rule of law is a key component of that. We talked today about actions that are occurring after the fall of the wall. And of course, that was such an historic moment. Those of us who served in the Reagan administration could have no idea when Ronald Reagan was elected president that the culmination of his stand and his strong words and his great leadership would result in not only the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the opportunity for so many more people around the great globe of ours to have freedom and have the opportunity for freedom. That battle continues even to this very day. We have a very distinguished panel with us this morning. I'm going to give you the bios of each of the panel members, and then I'm going to step down and let them make their presentations in one right after the other. Our first speaker this morning will be Natasha Srdac. Natasha Srdac received her master's in business administration, magna cum laude, from Bentley University, McCallum's Graduate School of Business in Waltham, Greater Boston, Massachusetts, USA. And she received her Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the University of Rijeka, Faculty of Economics, Rijeka, Croatia. Her early business and work experience includes Deutsche Bank AG in Cologne, Germany, to international banking as accounts manager for international and major businesses at Corporate Credit Department for HVB Bank Group, Zagreb, Croatia. In 2003, Srdac led the efforts to launch Croatia's first independent free market think tank to advance the rule of law and economic freedom in Croatia and Southeast Europe. A group of advisors and leaders from business, media, and think tanks were recruited to launch the Adriatic Institute and the International Leaders Summit. For 5 years, Srdac was regular contributor to the Economist Group's Economist Intelligence Unit. Srdac has briefed elected officials in Europe and the U.S. on issues ranging from the Balkans, economic reforms, and effective strategies to combat corruption in Eastern Europe. Srdac has also participated in strategic meetings and briefed prime ministers within Europe and senior administration officials in the White House on these matters. She co-authored a book with Joel Anand-Samy for Croatia and Southeast Europe titled Flat Tax, The Case for Tax Reform. Srdac's articles on the flat tax and tax reform have been translated into the languages including Chinese, English, French, and Russian, as well as the languages of Southeast Europe. Her op-eds have appeared in media outlets in Europe and the U.S., including the Wall Street Journal, EU Observer, Swiss-based print media, Le Temps, and media in Southeast Europe. That's a pretty impressive resume for the young lady who is going to address you just in a few moments. Our second speaker today is Judge Henry William Saad. After graduating magna cum laude from law school, Judge Saad practiced law with Dickinson Wright for 20 years, specializing in public and private sector labor law and constitutional law. He taught law school as an adjunct professor at 3 local law schools for roughly 30 of his last 40 years in the law, teaching public and private sector labor law. And he has been an appellate judge on the Michigan Court of Appeals for 19 years, including a term as chief judge. He is grateful and honored to have worked actively in President Reagan's 2 presidential campaigns and for having been a federal trial court and federal appeal court nominee of both Bush presidents. But this is important. He considers his singular and crowning achievement in life to be his marriage to the person he regards as God's blessing in his life, Mara Latika Saad. I made sure my husband read the line of the that Mara wrote. Well, that was beautiful. That was beautiful. Our third speaker this morning will be that lady, Mara Latika Saad. Her experiences are unique and remarkable in many ways, reflect her wonderful family success story of perseverance and commitment to faith and family. Mara was born in Germany during her father, Ilya's Latika's journey toward America after escaping communist rule in the former Yugoslavia. Mara attended the University of Michigan, where she earned a bachelor's degree in history. She traveled west to Seattle University to study law and stayed in the Northwest for 7 years, working as a prosecutor and a commercial litigator. Mara later joined the company started by her father and is currently the vice president and general counsel of Letica Corporation. She's testified in a hearing at the Senate Immigration Subcommittee on family immigration, small business, and entrepreneurship in 1997. She testified that her father witnessed the effects of communism: no food, no freedom, no opportunity, and ultimately escaped the tyranny of communism and eventually immigrated to America so he could fulfill his dreams, his entrepreneurial dreams. Her testimony supported the findings that the family is an institution that embodies an important form of social capital, and immigrants draw on that, and that common self-interest of family members provide financial and labor resources crucial to establishing successful enterprises. She advanced the ideas of a rule of law-based immigration policy for America. Now that also is a very important point we need to consider. Mara is active in many charities in the Detroit area community, serving on multiple boards, has been appointed by various governors of Michigan to numerous positions, and served on the board of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, a Michigan-based policy think tank. Of all of her work and efforts, she is most proud of her family, including having raised 2 children who are independently successful in their careers, and of whom she is very proud, and of her husband, the judge. She states that she works the lines of liberty every day, maintaining the rule of law. I'm sure there's more than one interpretation to that sentence. Our fourth speaker this morning will be Joel Anandasamy. He is the co-founder of the International Leaders Summit, a unique platform bringing together successful reformers and free market proponents and engaging entrepreneurs, business, media, and political leaders to advance pro-growth reform initiatives and principled solutions. Through Anandasamy's vision, the International Leaders Summit has built a network of like-minded leaders through its strategic events and venues, including the European Parliament in Brussels, Belgium, cities across Europe, and of course here in Washington, D.C. as well. In 2004, Natasha Srdac and Joel Anand-Samy co-founded the Adriatic Institute for Public Policy, committed to advancing economic freedom in the Balkan region. Through Anand-Samy and Srdac's leadership, the Adriatic Institute for Public Policy has engaged in a robust endeavor to promote the foundation of the rule of law, judicial reforms, protection of property rights, and combating corruption and organized crime in the post-communist and post-war Balkan region. During the 1990s, Anand-Samy spearheaded a private initiative that supported emergency relief, medical and economic projects in conflict and post-conflict regions, including Asia, East Africa, and the Balkans. Anand-Samy previously served as vice president of Jonathan and David Incorporated. He also served as treasurer-trustee of the Jonathan and David Foundation, a private foundation, and also led the marketing, communications, and advertising activities as a senior executive at the Zondervan HarperCollins Publishers, a division of News Corporation. Since 2008, Anand-Samy has been a senior advisor here at the Heritage Foundation and is one of our strategic allies in advancing work with new allies around the world. Finally, let me add that at some point during our program this morning, the 75th Attorney General of the United States of America, Edwin Meese, will be joining us. And when he is able to arrive, we will finish that speaker and then bring former Attorney General Ed Meese to the platform, and he will be able to make his remarks at that point. So let me just say we will have each speaker come to the podium. You've heard their introductions. We will hopefully have a time for questions at the end. But the points that are made today, let me just say that the Heritage Foundation wants to emphasize need to be made not only to the people who are in attendance today and the people who are watching us today on the internet, but will be captured and rebroadcast at a later time in many other venues. So thank you very much for your attention, and without further ado, Natasha Srdac, please come to the podium. Welcome to Heritage.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Becky, for your leadership in organizing this important panel and hopefully completing the unfinished work in much of Eastern Europe and Croatia. Thank you so much. I would like to start my presentation today with Margaret Thatcher's quote from her speech delivered in Zagreb in 1998. I quote, "Capitalism cannot, in fact, operate without a strong administration to police the laws that provide its framework, and it cannot succeed without honesty. Racketeers, black marketeers, and smugglers are not entrepreneurs. They're just plain criminals. Corruption and gangsterism are scourges which afflict many newly developing economies and states. They should be ruthlessly and fearlessly expunged. Otherwise, not just the free market, but freedom itself is in peril." Unquote. The fall of the Berlin Wall gave us hope that the transition to economic and political freedom was near, and the optimism spread among the people. However, the fall of the Berlin Wall was also a sign to communists that their era was ending. The communists quickly regrouped right after the time, actually at the time of the Berlin Wall falling in 1989, and before Croatia declared its independence from Yugoslavia in 1991, Croatia's communists started a grab on land and other property. I would like to take you through a presentation which actually brings us from a perspective what has been happening in Croatia and the region of Southeast Europe. So it's not just former Yugoslavia, but it's also the countries of Bulgaria and Romania with with lack of rule of law, poor protection of property rights, and that already joined the European Union. We see that the Balkan route, which originates in Afghanistan and goes through the countries via Iran, of Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, countries of former Yugoslavia, including Croatia, and it's used for trafficking of humans, of arms, of even drugs, terrorism financing. And what we see that there is a void. There is a coexistence of organized crime and political corruption. And what allows both to flourish is actually lack of independent judiciary and the rule of law. Slavery, human trafficking, is a 32 billion per year industry. There are 200,000 of estimated 1 million women that are trafficked through the Balkans. In a recent, actually this year's US State Department's report on human trafficking, which is called Trafficking in Persons Report 2013, it was astounding to find out that women and girls from the United States, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and other parts of Eastern Europe are subjected to sex trafficking in Croatia. The same report didn't mention any similar report about US women and girls trafficked in any other countries of Southeast Europe. It was also mentioned that the children are exploited in prostitution on the Adriatic coast, particularly during the peak tourist season. We see that arms trafficking also represents a problem, with Europol stating that the figure of 4 million unregistered illegal firearms in the Balkans is well known and remains deeply worrying. There's also a problem with drugs, drug trafficking. There are 20 billion per year of heroin trade to the Balkans. Albanian, Pakistani, and Turkish origin criminal groups dominate the trafficking in heroin. That's also from the Europol report. And then we know that 75% of the world's opium is produced in Afghanistan. There were attacks that were not really properly reported in the international media, or it has not bring so much attention like Benghazi situation, for example. There was an attack in autumn 2011 on the US Embassy in Sarajevo, where a police officer was seriously injured. We know of an attack in summer 2012, where 6 Israeli tourists were killed in Bulgaria. In this year, a Lebanese-Canadian bank was reported that it used U.S. banking system to launder proceeds and routing the terrorist group Hezbollah. And also, U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency confirmed that Hezbollah traffics cocaine and heroin to fund terrorism, which brings us back to the Balkan Route. It is interesting to quote Richard Holbrook's statement from his book To End the War. He says, Yugoslavia's tragedy was not foreordained. It was the product of bad, even criminal political leaders who encouraged ethnic confrontation for personal, political, and financial gain. Rather than tackle the concrete problems of governance in post-Tito era, they led their people into war. That makes so much more sense from today's perspective. This list shows us illicit financial outflows via crime, corruption, and tax evasion from the countries in the Balkans from 2001 to 2010. These are transactions that are reported actually in the banking system and to the trade reports that countries have with each other. So they do not include any cash transactions, and they are quite underestimated for the real money laundering that is going in the region. So these will be the amounts, as you can see, the highest nominal amount coming out of Serbia of $51.4 billion compared to also highest relative amount of Montenegro's having 138% of their GDP that left the country between 2001 and 2010. For Croatia, compared to the region, it is 25% of Croatia's gross domestic product. Well, we know the causes. We know the root cause problems. There are many facts that are known and that have not been addressed. And that's actually the purpose also of my presentation, to see how we are going to address the lack of the rule of law and independent judiciary in Croatia, which cannot be dealt from within. This is just a few facts about a bank that became actually from a regional bank, it became an international bank, very active in Southeast Europe, and whereby through a bailout that was given by German taxpayers, it was realized that some $3.6 billion were paid just for the losses of the bank in the Balkans. There were some 8 billion unaccounted loans that were given to different individuals in 12 different countries, and that 2 billion were siphoned off to the same bank by Croatia's and Austria's politicians to the accounts during the UN arms embargo. The timeline of Hypo Bank shows that there is a much larger problem, that we have not just Austria's banking institutions to deal with, but also Liechtenstein's institution. Practically, what was happening, there was a concerted effort to have the bank sold to German Bayerische Landesbank, and at the same time, it was just a shell, because the lucrative business of real estate company was divested, and also the accounts of the corrupt politicians and the partners in crime that were deposited actually in Hypo Alpe Adria Bank's branch office in Liechtenstein were taken over by an institution of industry and finance control owned by Prince Michael von Liechtenstein. Here we see how Austria's Hypo Alpe Adria group operated in the region. It is actually, they were receiving a cash, and that's the problem of that post-communist, quasi-post-communist, because we never really went into a transition into a market economy. But former communists that grabbed on power continued with very corrupt privatizations. They continued laundering money. They were siphoning money to private accounts via also during UN arms embargo. And all those monies were given back via loans into these different countries. So all these cases have been reported in the media locally, and something has been addressed in Austria, but it has not been resolved in any of the countries of Southeast Europe. This is an interesting book, and it is a book about largest gaming casino company in the world, which actually depicts some of the connections of how the laws are changed to favor the company, and how politicians at the high level, from the highest to the lowest level, are connected, including tax authorities in operations in different countries in Southeast Europe, connected through the gaming industry. A specific case shows us how organized crime works in the region. There was a situation with 100 million euros intercepted. 100 million euros were supposed to be laundered via Montenegro and Hypo Alpe Adria bank accounts in Liechtenstein for a drug lord who actually imported or brought drugs from Latin America via Montenegrin port. It showed that there was the operation was such that the investigators from Drug Enforcement Agency, actually U.S. intercepted that, and they really broke the drug ring. They realized that it would not be possible without insider participation from senior management at the Austrian bank. Here we see some reports from BBC on Montenegro, where they realized that the banking industry is really controlled. The main bank, first bank in 2010, controlled by the Prime Minister Djukanovic's family. There was a Bari prosecutor, some from Italy, Giuseppe Scelsi, who actually accused Montenegrin Prime Minister Djukanovic in their court report, I quote, to have promoted, run, set up, and participated in a mafia-type association. They eventually dropped the case because Mr. Djukanovic had diplomatic immunity. We come to the point who is going to address these threats. These threats are significant, and they are affecting the people living on the lands of the Balkans, in the Balkan states. They're affecting Europe, they're affecting the West. We have to remind ourselves that while American soldiers were dying in Afghanistan, the Balkan Route was flourishing, bringing proceeds of crime to terrorist group. And we also saw reports that Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda are also financed by the proceeds from drug trafficking, and 75% of heroin is obviously originating in Afghanistan. So we see that when we come to the point who is going to address these issues, just to have a little picture of what is going on with political figures in the region. Member of European Parliament, Strasser, who was Austria's former interior minister. Interior minister in Austria means police minister. and national security, responsible for national security. He accepted offers up to $100,000 in exchange to water down financial regulation laws. There's former Austria's finance minister Grasser, who received 450,000 bribe from Novomatic to reform gambling law in Austria. There is EU Commissioner, current EU Commissioner for Regional Policy from Austria, who is responsible for the EU funds disbursement. This is the second largest budget they have after agriculture at the EU level. Johannes Hahn, he was CEO of Novomatic. And I would like to also remind you that a US State Department did flag Novomatic for casinos in Paraguay, Peru, and South Africa, countries where they operate, were tagged by the US as money laundering conduits for criminal bosses and drug barons. So you have Latin America, you have Montenegro, you have the Balkan Route, you have heroin trafficking, you have cocaine trafficking coming from Latin America. It is something, it's mind-boggling, and we need to address these issues. So we look again at the region. We have, for example, Customs Chief of Croatia, HDZ. He was jailed for building party slush funds. He was responsible for policing the borders. And it's interesting to mention that former Romania's Prime Minister, former Croatia's Prime Minister, Slovenia's Prime Minister are jailed, all three jailed for corruption, with the cases coming triggered from abroad. So it wasn't really initiated from within, I would say. And then we have Montenegro's Prime Minister Đukanović, who is under diplomatic immunity. Austria, the Alpine corruption paradise, there is an article about this, and actually it just affirms what has been said and reported in other sources. The problem is that there is damage to Austrians as well, caused by corrupt practices at some 27 billion euros, or 8% of the country's budget. The Liechtenstein, it's interesting to mention that we have European report, Council of Europe, which says, when they talk about the rule of law, what we have in Liechtenstein is that the prince retains in principle the power to block and terminate any investigation of prosecution. So we cannot really expect anything to be initiated from Liechtenstein's side. On the other side, we have to go back. We go back to the U.S. We realize that the drug enforcement agencies, American agency, did broke the cocaine ring in the Balkan region. And it's interesting that also through U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, United States did penalize Deutsche Telekom with $95 million for bringing foreign officials in Macedonia and Montenegro via Hungary. Then we actually requested we actually requested from Deutsche Telekom to show us the contract, because Deutsche Telekom's operation in Croatia has not been addressed. Anyway, Siemens was also bribing officials, including Eastern Europe. They paid $1.6 billion. Daimler Chrysler, they got a settlement for $185 million for bribing officials in Eastern Europe, and Pfizer $45 million. The fact is that all these cases have been initiated by the states, and we have not seen any of the culprits being prosecuted, being found. So practically nothing is going on. It's like nothing happened. Just the case does not exist. And that has to be actually also triggered somehow, that we see justice to be served in those countries. We have U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation in July 2008. In its report, actually, I quote, said that LGT is a leading Liechtenstein financial institution that is owned by and financially benefits the Liechtenstein royal family. And they are advising U.S. clients to open accounts in the name of Liechtenstein foundations to hide their beneficial ownership of the account assets, and establish transfer corporation to disguise asset transfers to and from LGT accounts. And actually, they conclude that LGT, which is owned by royal family, enabled LGT clients to use the bank services to evade U.S. taxes, dodge creditors, and ignore court orders. So U.S. Senate obviously initiated a very important a very important thing to start dealing with money laundering with Liechtenstein, which is very connected to the region. We have, on the other side, when we look at the European Union and what we can expect from European Union, we had our Member of Parliament from UK actually ask an official question. They call it the written question of European Commission, where European Commission has to respond. And his question was about money laundering connected to Hypo Alpe Adria and the divestment of that real estate arm that I mentioned to you. And practically the European Commission just says that the Commission has no competence to investigate schemes such as those described by the honourable member. This is the responsibility of the relevant national authorities and ultimately of national courts. But if you remember that if national authorities have individuals that are taking bribes, and if those individuals are involved in border policing, in Interior Department, which is a police department, national security, if those individuals are prime ministers, how can we expect from national authorities to resolve any of these cases? There was another question that Roger Helmer, member of European Parliament from UK, asked of European Commission, asking actually specifically about Liechtenstein and about the fact that at the time of the banks being sold to Bayerische Landesbank, which is a German bank, the accounts of corrupt politicians and their private partners in crime were sheltered in Liechtenstein's bank, taken over by Prince Michael von Liechtenstein. How can that happen? German taxpayers were bailing out the bank. Austrian taxpayers just were approved by European Commission to be able to bail the bank by additional $8 billion euros, while 8 billion euros are unaccounted for in the whole region of Southeast Europe, and this is not being investigated. So Roger Helmer asked the question again of European Commission, and we got an easy answer. They say, on the question of whether the Commission is aware of the Croatian authorities requesting information from the Liechtenstein authorities, the Commission recalls that this is a matter for the relevant Croatian authorities. The Commission cannot intervene in any such procedures. It's not just laundering money that belongs to the politicians that were corrupt, that we have crony capitalism, but we have a Balkan Route. We have trafficking in humans, organs, arms trafficking, and drug trafficking going through the region. And we have organized crime coexisting with political corruption in the region. And what allows both to flourish is the lack of rule of law, a lack of independent judiciary. We cannot deal with these issues from within. And just a few items, actually a few things about Croatia. Croatia has fraudulent elections, which was actually admitted by the government. There were 1 million illegal votes for a country of 4 million people. That means that half of the parliament could have been voted in based on non-existent votes. Balkan criminals possessing Croatian passports. Practically in 2012, there was a group of criminals, they say belonging to a Balkan organized crime, were arrested in Spain. And they were found to have all Croatian passports. So the investigations led directly to the Ministry of Interior of Croatia, and the track record of sale of these passports since 2006, no high-level officials was held responsible. So we have continued unresolved 15.2 billion and larger amounts of illicit financial outflows. So this amount is just from 2001 to 2010. So there are larger amounts since 1991. We have crime, corruption, and tax evasion. And another very interesting, one thing is it's interesting to mention that the court system doesn't really work, and the U.S. State Department reported about 850,000 backlogged cases in the court system. And just another thing that the Supreme Court president, there's no distinction between the right and wrong. If a Supreme Court president approves a convicted war criminal to lead the electoral list in the parliament election in December 2012, which was then addressed, but it was too late because it already had an effect. also, as a result of that, also we have a depressed economy. We have Croatia, for example, has 22% unemployment and 54% unemployment among the youth. And just to show you a few pictures of the victims of corruption in the region. So the lady was attacked. She was a journalist in Montenegro. The gentleman was actually also attacked. He was also in Montenegro. Actually, all three of Montenegro. On the right-hand side, this is a person that was killed in 2004 for reporting about organized crime. And the recent reports actually that were reported by Set Times was that the police actually admitted to having been involved. So official police of Montenegro, their forces that have been involved in actually beating up journalists in Montenegro. And here we have also some victims of corruption. We see in the middle Ivo Pukanic with glasses. He was killed in a car bomb explosion in 2008 in central Zagreb, and he was reporting about organized crime, and he was actually a key witness in a case considering Hypo Adria Bank. The lady was also killed to the right. That's a daughter of a lawyer who was defending a person also connected to Hypo Adria Bank. And these cases were considered unrelated, and practically for the lady, they said that a homeless person killed her. So this has to be opened up and resolved. So what we need actually is that we need principled solutions. We need to establish the rule of law and independent judiciary in Croatia, in the region of Southeast Europe, and it won't happen from within. We see that the European Union doesn't have a muscle at this stage to trigger investigations, to be able to impose foreign assistance in a way. So I believe that we need to look up to also American leadership to see how we can have visiting judges and visiting prosecutors come to Croatia to help honest judges that are in the system, that do not get the cases, that are threatened, that are afraid actually to come out, to be able to establish gradually with new generation of law graduates that will see actually in judicially an honest profession, an honest calling, to be able to gradually establish the rule of law and independent judiciary in Croatia. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Natasha, for the invitation to be here today, and thank you to the Heritage Foundation. When judges in the United States, and specifically in Michigan, where I am an appellate judge, when we do our work, it sounds so simple after I've listened to Natasha's speech, a breach of contract between two parties, handling whether this case involves a domestic relations dispute or another case where we're applying the Miranda ruling to a confession. It almost sounds quaint when you listen to the kind of problems that Natasha's talking about. I mean, it's complex enough for judges who one day practices law, the next day puts on a robe, and then has to make some decisions about complex cases. If you, on the other hand, look at what Natasha's talking about in a country that hasn't had a history of the rule of law, a culture of the rule of law, how does one place in this soil the roots of a system that have been contaminated by a totalitarian government where it's government by men and thugs as opposed to the rule of law? That question was asked, as Natasha knows and my wife Mara knows, a number of years ago. I think it was roughly 2001, the then Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Croatia convened a conference in Zagreb, and Mara asked if I would go on behalf of the ABA and the United States. There was a judge from Germany, from England, from all over the world. The president of the World Judges Conference was there. And the title of the conference that was held in Zagreb in 2001, and the Supreme Court Justice of Zagreb gave it the specific title. I remember talking to him at a dinner afterwards. He entitled it "The Centrality of the Rule of Law to the Development of a Free Market Constitutional Republic Post-Communism." And not only was the sentence complicated, but so was the subject. And he recognized, because he was a very bright fellow, how do you go from telephone justice, you will rule this way, comrade, to a system where you look at the body of law and ask the question, what does the law require us to do in this case? A law that will be equally applicable to everybody, equal justice under the law. If you haven't had that history, how do you make that shift? That's why he convened the conference. That's the question that was asked. And I remember during that conference, I read to him a quote that he was very familiar with, because he was obviously very familiar with our Constitution. And like a lot of the former Eastern Bloc countries, the ABA was working with the various institutions of justice in Eastern Europe and Slovenia and others, trying to model constitutions and frameworks of law to fit within the culture of that country. So the Chief Justice was very familiar with our Constitution and with Madison, who was the primary author. And we talked at dinner, and he said, well, what do you think, Judge Saad, is the most important thing that Madison did with respect to the Constitution? And I said, I think the most important thing he did was to say what is the proper predicate to the rule of law and an independent judiciary. Because you can proclaim you have one, you can call it independent, you can say we have the rule of law. I think Russia has rule of law and constitutional language all over the place that they violate routinely, of course, and then put people in jail that they don't like. Or I think the same thing is in Zimbabwe, when Mugabe wanted certain things done, and he promised the rule of law, and when the justices of the Supreme Court didn't do what he wanted them to do, his program, he put a gun to their head and said, you will rule this way. And when they miraculously and bravely refused to do so, he just got rid of them, put in his own Supreme Court. So how do you make that conversion? And the words that we talked about that evening in Zagreb in 2001 were these. The most important thing that Madison said, and probably the quote that is most often heard from Madison, is this: "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" And you know the rest of the quote about if men were angels and so forth. But that first sentence is, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If you don't have as a predicate good people who want to do what is right, and instead of gaming the system or playing games with the system or circumventing the system, we see it in our own country. It's not just folks in Croatia who are in jail. I mean, we have 2 ex-Illinois governors who are in federal prison. It happens everywhere. But we know that in the United States, the rule of law is taking some hits. I don't have to detail what they are. Everybody in this room knows what they are. When the rule of law is circumvented here, there are institutions like Heritage and Hoover and others who try to do something about it, take great pains to do something about it, to bring it out, to litigate it. And there are good organizations who, when they see somebody circumventing the rule of law, if they can't get it through Congress, let's slip it through their administrative agency, and there's litigation. Except if you don't have that fail-safe of litigation of an independent judiciary in the rule of law, as Natasha meant, then where do you go? Of course, if your judiciary is also working hand in hand with the very people who are trying to circumvent the law, then you got a problem. And so when we were in Zagreb in 2001, and we read that statement again, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, therefore, as Madison did as the primary author of that and the Federalist Papers, he went on to say, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, and I'm sure he meant that generically, not in a sexist way, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And what controls are there on the judiciary other than judicial restraint? Because if I get a case and I think, you know, I disagree with this policy of the governor or the legislature, or if I'm in the federal system of Congress, if I disagree, I will find it unconstitutional. How? Well, I'll just pretend it's unconstitutional. I'll figure out a way. If that is my mindset, if I don't comply with what is the heart of the constitutional provisions for judges, that is to interpret the law, not to make it up or to make up just to comply with your own will, then the judiciary is not much of a check. So even in a system of laws with an independent judiciary, which we have in the United States, there are significant problems. You go back to Croatia in 2001, and when the fundamental question asked is, do we even have people who understand this, who will hear the words and actually feel what needs to be done? If telephone justice continues, if you have, let's say, 50 judges who are used to telephone justice as opposed to the rule of law, and then they say, okay, now we have a constitution, now we have the rule of law, and 48 of the 50 are still communists who just changed their suits, and they're still doing telephone justice, they're just calling it by a different name, nothing much is going to happen. So that is, and people ask, well, how is it that, I was talking with a gentleman last night about the rule of law in Afghanistan, and he said, yes, some people doing contracts in Afghanistan, very large contracts, said, yes, we talk about the rule of law, they understand contract is all for acceptance and consideration, and then they'll say, okay, now how do you pay me off? Give me my money, give me my bribe. And the person I was talking to said, well, remember, we're talking about the rule of law, which says offer, accept. Yes, that's all very good, I agree. Now, give me my money, give me my bribe. And he said that, sadly, those who understand the rule of law and know its importance, and who are very bright, good people in Afghanistan, are getting out of Dodge, because they know that that's not going to work in Afghanistan, because it's still tribal, it's still payoffs, it's still thugocracy, it's not the rule of law, it's not people seeking to do good and the public good. So that's the problem there. What is the problem in a lot of the Eastern European countries where the ABA has put together constitutional frameworks? It goes to the heart of the question of the character of the people who are going to apply that law. You can have all the documents in the world, and if people say, all right, now how do I game the system? I'm going to put a gun to somebody's head who's a judge, as you were referring to, and maybe not physically, but the point, they understand the point, the threats to their life, their families, and so forth. Extremely, extremely difficult. Nonetheless, how are you going to get it done other than education? And it's teaching new generations and getting people involved who have the courage, the discipline, the goodwill, the heart, the soul, the belief in God and country, faith and family. All the things that we know make things work here. You have to do that to make it work there. The organic documents of our country, the 4 organic documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the Northwest Ordinance, which comprise, as we know, fundamentally the organic documents of our country and the source of our constitutional law, our free market republic, interestingly understood precisely that if you did not have a moral base, if you did not have good people, you could put together all the checks and balances and federalism and so forth, and it was not going to work. Fundamental to all that is educating your people about the importance of faith, family. And in the Northwest Ordinance, those of us who love that document let me go to what they say. They considered education to be very important to the process, and it is. If you don't have it, if you don't educate the next group of people who will be administering the laws, the judges, it's not going to work. Let me find the quotation here, which from the Northwest Ordinance, if I can. Well, I can't find it right now, of course, when you want to get it. But in essence, what it says is that to have good government, you have to have religion, you have to have faith, you have to have love of country, and it has to be taught to your children. And it has to be part of your culture, part of your nature, part of your national sovereignty, your DNA. And the Northwest Ordinance, which was the first to establish actually areas to have where the government gave property to have education for children, in essence said, if you want good government and the happiness of your people, you must first educate them to understand about morality and faith and family. So I'm a judge, not a philosopher or a moralist, but I know that as I see doing my job every day, as I see other judges doing their job, it is very easy to slip from those bounds of what you know to be right and do something wrong. Most people know the difference between right and wrong. It's a choice. It's a fundamental choice. And you look back to our conference in Zagreb in 2001, and there were a lot of people who wanted the right thing to happen. They didn't want telephone justice. They wanted precedent. They wanted the rule of law, where everybody plays by the same rules, because if they don't, it devolves into the law of the jungle. I've watched since then what's happened in Croatia, and I'm an optimist by nature, and I know that in our country it didn't happen overnight. Folks arrived here in about 1500 or so, and about 1800 or so, 300 years later, we started putting together a fairly concrete structure for constitutional law. But in the last couple hundred years, it's been worked on and improved, and with problems. So I don't know how long Zagreb has been independent, Natasha, what is it, 1991? Relatively new. And I think as long as people like you do the kind of work you do and your husband, and with the help of your institute and Heritage, which does such wonderful work, and others throughout the United States and throughout the world who care about what happens. Witness what's going on in Kiev. They're out there in the streets. It's the Orange Revolution again. No, you should not put a gun to our head to say that we can't have freedom. And people stand up for that. It takes courage. It takes character. It takes morality. The judges who do the job are, to me, a very small part of that. Our job is to understand the limits of our role. The legislature makes the law. We should interpret the law. Everyone in the United States who takes the bench, whether it's federal or state, the only requirement is that they put their hand on the Constitution and swear to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, not any other document, just the Constitution of the United States. I say just, but that is the key. That's what the president does. That's what every judge does, state or federal. That's the heart of it. And when you take that oath, you have to be true to your oath, true to your word. And I'm glad there are people like you working to try to make sure that happens in Croatia. And maybe 10 years from now we'll have this conference again, look back and say they've made a lot of progress. I hope so. Thank you for letting me be here. Thank you.
We sincerely thank the leadership of Becky Norton Dunlop and the Heritage Foundation for hosting this important event on the unfinished work after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as many of us have observed what transpired in Eastern Europe throughout the region of Southeast Europe, we realize that There have been some progress made in certain parts of Eastern Europe and also challenges in other parts of the region. When I look at what's transpiring in, for example, the Balkans, I also look at some of the unique stories that we hear from the Baltic region. And I call it sort of the Baltic blessings and the Balkan challenges. And before I share that very unique story about the changes that we see in the Baltics in comparison to the Balkans, I'd like to share just a brief story about our discussion with Milton Friedman. Dr. Friedman actually had traveled to a number of countries in the 1960s during his sabbatical, and he spent some time in Russia, he spent some time in former Yugoslavia, spent some time in Belgrade, went over to Sarajevo and then also to Dubrovnik, and studied these different economies. And on the eve of founding and launching the Adriatic Institute for Public Policy, we visited with Milton and Rose Friedman and just asked them to provide some insights into their experiences and what happened in the Eastern European countries that they were advising and suggesting reforms. And the first thing that he shared with us was that learn from the experiences in Russia. Now, this is a gentleman who is a Nobel laureate, and he was very open, very transparent in his discussion, and shared that they made a mistake by pushing for the terms privatization, privatization, privatization. And instead, he said, this is Milton Friedman, saying that we should have stressed the rule of law, the rule of law, the rule of law. In fact, he mentioned that we had taken for granted that they would be these democratic institutions, the rule of law that would prevail in Russia, in other parts of Eastern Europe. And so, as Judge Saad was mentioning about the streets of Ukraine today, we do realize that without the rule of law, without protection of property rights, without having an independent judiciary, those issues really become challenges. I'll make my remarks very brief here. We have Attorney General Edmund Meese with us. But over the past decade, we can notice by looking at what has transpired in Southeast Europe by saying that over $100 billion of U.S. and EU taxpayer funds have gone into Southeast Europe in aid and in various other forms of assistance. But at the same time, as a slide that Natasha was sharing with us, that over $111.6 billion during that same period of time left the region via crime, corruption, and tax evasion. So while we taxpayers are funding aid projects, the same or equivalent amount of money leaves the country. In regard to the Baltic experience and the Balkan experiences, the uniqueness of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were certainly unique. We had Martla in the country of Estonia that advanced free market principles, and also we had that unique opportunities to see the Nordic states have a tremendous positive influence in the Baltics. You had Sweden, you had Finland, and if you notice Finland's Transparency International report, it's one of the highest. So they brought those best practices, those higher standards to Estonia. However, when we look at what transpired in Croatia and much of the Southeast Europe region, we saw weak rule of law states, as Natasha indicated, with Austria not having strong anti-corruption laws. In fact, as a person who served on the AmCham Croatia board, the American Chamber of Commerce, we always noticed and observed that it was very difficult for American business to operate in Southeast Europe because American businesses had to uphold the American laws and the FCPA. And so they are not in a condition where a lot of the German or perhaps the Austrian companies that were listed were involved in bribery. They were limited because of America's rule of law. So we do see that important influence of the United States through the FCPA and other very important initiatives too. I'd just like to mention about the media freedom issue as well, which is so important in some of these countries which are making that important transition from a post-communist state. And I think it is important for leaders in the West, whether we look at Ukraine, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, all of those countries, Montenegro, for example, to truly encourage independent voices, support those that are in the media community, because they are the voices at the local level that are communicating the truth and encouraging their local individuals to complete that unfinished work. And so I'll just conclude by saying that we truly do need principled leadership, and America is a nation that has stood for the rule of law, protection of property rights, and it can certainly play a role in Europe, where we see the European Union has failed on so many different levels. And so we look forward to seeing this develop in the days to come, and look forward to the American leadership from both the Senate and the House also addressing some of these issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to bring to the podium now the 75th Attorney General of the United States of America, who not only was a tremendous leader in the cabinet of President Ronald Reagan in terms of the justice in our own country, but actually became an international leader in terms of raising the standards and talking to people about the importance of the rule of law and the independent judiciary. General Ed Meese.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good to be with you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here for the whole meeting this morning, the whole conference, but I did want to have the chance to be here, and just particularly to commend the people that are here speaking with you, and particularly Natasha and Joel, on what they have done with the Adriatic Institute and the leadership that they've given on a very important topic. We spend a lot of time here at Heritage, particularly our legal center, on constitutionalism, the rule of law, and the kinds of things that you've been talking about this morning. And I'd just like to mention just a couple aspects of this. The Constitution of the United States was a totally new idea when it was developed in 1787 and ratified in 1789. And the idea of having a written constitution was something totally new in the world. And as somebody has said in commenting on it, there were a lot of lawyers in the room and they wanted to get it in writing. And so, but that was an important thing, because it was in fact a written compact, if you would, between the people who had gone through a great deal of suffering under the wrong kind of government, which led, of course, to the War for Independence. And so they wanted to be sure that they were able to have a government that would not oppress the people, as the King George and the royal governors had for so many decades. And so it was important to have a constitution that did something that they felt was the key to keeping the people from being oppressed. And that was that they would get control of the power of government. And they did it in two ways, or a number of ways actually, but one particular way was to diffuse the power. As you know, they diffused it between the states and the central government by specifying with particularity what the powers of the federal government really were, and that the rest of governmental power was left to the states. And then they divided power horizontally by having the three separate and independent branches. And then the Constitution then, in writing, specified this and many other features, the principles for operating the government in a way that preserved the freedom and liberty of the people. And then the other thing that they did was to have an independent judiciary, and the independent judiciary being separate from the other two branches, the parliamentary or congressional branch and the executive branch, so that it would fairly rule on the interpretation of the Constitution. And I know you've talked this morning about an independent judiciary and how important that is, and a judiciary that has sufficient power and sufficient status among the people so that it can carry out this responsibility. I would like to add one other aspect, which Joel has just been talking about, and that is one of the functions of government, its principal function really, is to preserve the liberty of the people, the safety of the people, both against foreign forces that would endanger the national security, but also it's the function of government at all levels to protect the people in their safety and to provide for the rule of law being enforced in a fair and uniform manner and where it can protect the people against two types of situations. Those aspects of government itself which would in any way interfere with the liberty of the people, and secondly, those private actors, if you will, that would endanger the operations, the freedom of the people to be free, particularly in their persons, free in terms of public safety, and also free in terms of economic freedom from those who, through corruption or crime, would in any way keep people from being able to act fairly and to be treated fairly and safely within the economic matters. And that's why the work that the Adriatic Institute has particularly emphasized the things that you heard about this morning in terms of crony corruption, in terms of governmental corruption, in terms of criminal activity, particularly in terms of the market and in terms of economic affairs. These are the kinds of things that they are seeking, as you've heard, to wipe out and to encourage governments to fairly operate and to operate in a way which takes away the potential for corruption and for economic crime and those things which are the antithesis of a free market and a free economy. And so I just wanted to be here to, for a few minutes, just to congratulate them on what they're doing, to mention that those of us in the United States are very supportive of what they're doing, because we see it as a continuation and extension of what was started in our country 2 centuries ago, and in which the governments and the people of free countries have a duty and a responsibility to support those who are working to perfect freedom and liberty in the countries, particularly in the post-Cold War period. So I thank them for what they're doing. Thank you for being with the group this morning here, and and particularly encourage them to go forward with the knowledge that here at Heritage particularly, we fully support what you're doing, and we consider it a privilege to work with you in expanding freedom, free markets, and the rule of law throughout the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now we'll go to a time of questions. So if you do have a question, we have a microphone in the room. I'd like for you to wait until the microphone arrives, then give us your name, and if you're associated with an organization, an embassy, visiting from abroad, let us know who you are and where you're from. Any questions? Okay, I see a questioner in the back.
For anyone on the panel, my name is Michael Zach. Question is, how can the Balkan countries look to the United States for help in establishing constitutional governance when the administration of our country is disregarding the law so much here?
Well, I think, let me, the judge, you spoke briefly about some of the challenges we have in our country. Let me just have you address that, and then Natasha or Joel, if you have comments.
I think the first thing to note about what's going on in our country is that the struggle to maintain the rule of law has always been there, right from the beginning. When Chief Justice Marshall of the Supreme Court, the most venerated justice ever in the United States Supreme Court history, held in Marbury v. Madison that it was the Supreme Court that got to say, let's say this is the Constitution, what the Constitution means. Jefferson, who believed in government with a small g, wrote a letter about his cousin, Marshall, distant cousin, who he despised, that they ought to take these guys out and hang them from the highest tree because that was the biggest power grab in the history of the United States, the rather short history. In other words, he believed, Jefferson did, that it's not the judiciary who should say what the Constitution means, whether legislation passed by Congress is constitutional. Congress should say whether it's constitutional. And of course, some believe that the president should say whether it's constitutional. So there has always been differences about where the power lies. The constitutional framework, though complicated, has been worked out fairly well over the last couple hundred years. Although I would recommend to anybody who is concerned about some of the current problems that have accumulated over the last 200 years, to read the Liberty Amendments, the recent book by Mark Levin, which talks about suggestions for modifications of the Constitution to remedy some of the problems that have come about as a result of what he regards as playing games with the Constitution in some quarters. But to your point, I think the world still looks to the United States as a beacon of hope and freedom and constitutional rule of law, where we all play by the same rules, are subject to the same rules. Are there going to be issues and problems throughout history currently where there'll be 100 years from now? Yes, but fundamentally the United States is a rule of law country. A judge here or there may go off the reservation and do precisely what he or she wants to do, but sometimes that judge will be overturned. The genius of our system, looking at the judiciary, for example, is that you have trial judges, 1, appellate judges, 3, typically Supreme Court judges in every state, 5, 7, or 9, as in the United States. So you have lots of eyes and minds working and looking at it, a lot of law clerks, a lot of professors, law schools. So people are not working in a vacuum, and whereas some people may want to do an end run around the law, and some of it is very obvious to those, and we think it's sad because you depreciate the rule of law when you flaunt it and you live in the first person singular as an executive. I will do this, I will do that, when we know the Constitution is meant to say it's we, the people. And the legislature passes something, the judiciary will interpret it, the executive branch enforces it, everybody has their role, but nobody is king. We don't want that to be eroded in this country, so a lot of people, like in this institution, are fighting to keep what is very precious and valuable. And I think it is the greatest, and there is still American exceptionalism, and I think countries around the world still look to the United States as a model, and we can help and still do. So while we may have fallen here or tripped there or have problems, it doesn't mean that we don't know what the right thing is and that we can't help those who are trying to do what they think is the right thing in Croatia and other countries. They can always point to us and say, isn't it hypocritical that you say X when you're doing minus X? But I think for the most part, the people in our country are law-abiding citizens who believe in fair play and want to see it apply to people equally. And despite flaws here and there, for the most part, I think for 200 years we've done a pretty good job. And I think the world recognizes that. And I still think we have the moral authority, therefore. You know, you're going to have a Jefferson every now and then who says, this guy just did a great power grab. But we'll come back to the center. And I hope still be that shining light on the hill that Reagan talked about in 1980 at the acceptance speech.
Natasha, did you want to add anything?
Yes, right. I wanted to, from 3 angles. Practically, we realized that drug enforcement agencies broke actually the ring, the cocaine ring in the Balkans. U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Investigations raised an issue of Liechtenstein's bank being involved in money laundering from the U.S. side, which hasn't actually triggered any investigations in the Balkans, but it did in Germany. Thirdly, U.S. Security and Exchange Commission with the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act going after companies involved in bribing foreign officials in the Eastern Europe does bring results, but we have to see that translated in the region. From that, so practically U.S. was effective, and the only U.S. was effective in the region. On the other side, I think that this provides an example of where you are going to get if you do not uphold the rule of law. Because we see, if there is no rule of law, we do have a coexistence of organized crime and political corruption. And it is so obvious. It is because there's no rule of law. It is because there's no independent judiciary. And thirdly, it is very important also what Judge Saad said, about we the people. This is so unique about U.S. Constitution. If you look at an attempt by European Commission, actually by the EU, to impose an EU constitution on all EU member states, it was called EU Lisbon Treaty. It wasn't passed, but practically it was passed in a different document. It's called differently, but trying to impose an EU constitution on all EU member states, which starts with the Queen Elizabeth of Great Britain, the Queen of Belgium, the President, the King, the President of Czech Republic, and so on. Give these rights to the people. So we look up to the United States because it comes down to the people to say, we need the rule of law in our country, because if we don't have it, we're going to end up like the Balkans, like the rest of the world that doesn't have the rule of law.
Just to affirm what Natasha was mentioning is that American exceptionalism and what America certainly presents to the world is so important. Yes, we have our challenges here at home, but the rest of the world, when you look at Ukraine, you look at other parts of the world, and even in Asia, they certainly look up to the two documents that we have, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution. Those are unique documents. And as Natasha stressed, we the people, not we the government. And that's what we have in a lot of these post-communist countries, is that transition is certainly needs all the help from important corners to be able to move forward the advancement of the rule of law, to raise a new generation. I think that is so important. Judge Saad mentioned that as well, to raise a new generation that will take seriously the importance of upholding the rule of law, advancing it, and also advancing economic freedom.
And just one note to the next generation. I was looking for that quote from the Northwest Ordinance, and of course I found it because I ripped it out of a book. I was looking in the book, but I tend to write in the book. But it was, this Northwest Ordinance was being written at the same time of the Constitution, which is why it's regarded as one of our organic founding documents. And to Joel's point, the third article of the Northwest Ordinance declares, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged. And of course they funded them. But again, that's the predicate that Madison was talking about, if men were angels, but government is a reflection of the people. So the more you have people who want to do good, who believe in the rule of law, not just utter the words, but actually believe in it. And that takes education. You can't, if it's so difficult to convince the world about what we have or our children, then maybe we have not been doing a good job in educating our own so that they can then continue, as Reagan said, which is one generation away from losing liberties, because he understood that just words on paper don't matter. It has to be in your DNA.
And I think the final point I would just add, we have to be aspirational in our goals. And the one thing about our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence is it provides that aspiration. We people, individuals, we're all fallen people. And so as we've heard from the panel, there are going to be challenges even here in the United States of America. But we always strive as a people to get back to that ideal. And the beauty of our Declaration and our Constitution is it does provide guidance for the rest of the world about something that works, where the government, as the Attorney General said, is supposed to defend the rights of people to be free and secure in their own lives. So aspiration's the key there. Okay, yes, sir, and then we'll move across the room.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard Ranger. I'm with API, but I'm here out of interest in the subject. And I have a question for the panel. Is there not a symbiotic relationship between the rule of law and the dispersal of power? I'm thinking, Judge Saad, about your capturing of the experience of the Northwest Ordinance, which, among other things, favored the dispersal of property among many individuals as opposed to large land grants, where you have, and the experience of, that you spoke of, Mr. Nansami, about the you coming at privatization as opposed to the rule of law. The fact that you create 4 or 5 big hunks of private property doesn't necessarily mean you have a rule of law, because you have capital and wealth concentrated. So is there something that can happen in the independent Baltic republics that favors, encourages, protects, and acknowledges the rights of people in their property, in their persons, to help assure that dispersal of power?
Okay. One thing that happened with actually communism is that the property was denied, private property was denied. The real intentions of communists, and that's something that we actually talked about also last night, is that communists, to understand a communist, frankly, there was no ideology behind it. Most of it was just opportunism. We see it from today's perspective in Southeast Europe. So they just regrouped, did not change, they just transitioned into a new system that they called capitalism or market economy. So that people, that's why we have this backlash against capitalism, and we can't call it, if I call it capitalism in Croatia, it's a derogatory term. Even market economy is a derogatory term. So we're trying with private enterprise, perhaps that sounds a little bit better. But what I'm trying to say is that the property has not been restituted. The laws have been passed to cement the injustices because the legislation was taken, legislator power. Apparently, there's no separation of powers. So we have legislative, executive, and judiciary held by the same group of people that reigned during communism, and they changed their clothes. They became different. They haven't. And we have a situation that we don't have a market economy, that property has not been restituted back. Certain cases, yes, but larger properties, they're trying to actually stall it. And we do not have property rights. And that actually also the case of 860,000 backlog cases in Croatia's system shows that most of it is also property rights, shows that it's very hard to have certainty about investing in and how do you protect your property in Croatia? So that is a problem, also connected with the rule of law.
And as to the specific question about the interrelationship, the symbiosis between the rule of law and centralization of power, the Constitution was designed with Acton's admonition in mind. As you know, Richard, one of the brightest minds, Lord Acton, even though the Constitution preceded him, his sentiments were there, and that is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is why you have branches of government, which is why you have federalism, which is why the Constitution provided specific powers to the federal government because they didn't want that to get too big. State government had its power, and then the people retained power, and then they had the Bill of Rights. So it is a design to disperse power, and the Northwest Ordinance the same thing. Rather than having large land grants to large groups of organizations, it dispersed it among the people. And that happened throughout the history of the United States, with the idea being that the more local control, the more local government, volunteerism, keeps at bay that huge central government that everybody's worried about because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, Lord Acton's admonition. Unfortunately, it's been shifting for the last 200 years in the other direction. And as you know, the Leviathan, which everybody warned about, where all the branches of government are in one, while you've just the alphabet agencies in the United States, where they make the rules, they enforce the rules, they break down your doors, they judge whether you're right or wrong, they throw you in jail. So all of a sudden, well, where's the separation of powers? And Mark Levin's book, a wonderful new book, deals with that very important question. That has to be corrected because we are going in the wrong direction. But nonetheless, the framework is meant to keep power dispersed, premised on Acton's admonition, and that is the symbiosis. And if in Croatia all three branches are in one, and then it's like Mugabe.
Right. Would not you say also, in addition to the dispersal of power, that the concept of transparency is critical?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And that's why everything has to be done out in the open. And when you have, if the president vetoes and the Congress comes back and all this is supposed to be done out in the open, if that's not done, if it's done behind closed door, the Star Chamber kind of rule of law or telephone justice. I remember when I talked to one of the judges in Croatia, in Zagreb in 2001, I said, well, you know, we have law books, we look up the law on computers and the precedent and to figure out what the law requires us to do in this particular dispute. What do you do? And she says, we make it up as we go along. And I thought, wow, that's, how do you apply the rule of law fairly, equitably to everybody on the thing if you're making it up as you know? They didn't have much to go on, understandably, so it's not meant as a criticism, but the rule of law is the antithesis of we make it up as we go along. The rule of law is the antithesis of I will do this because I happen to be the executive. No, you're one person. You're a steward for a short period of time. And that Congress passes legislation, you can't amend it on your own by a wave of, then you are becoming a dictator. And that's dangerous, and some people, even who teach con law, don't understand that.
Joel, did you want to add something there?
Just to briefly, in regard, when we look at the United States, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and we compare that to what's going on in the continent of Europe, there is a gulf. You have the common law, which the UK and the United States apply, but in the continental Europe, it's totally different. And I think that becomes sort of that Achilles heel of what we see in Europe, and therefore a weak rule of law, as the judge was mentioning. If you don't have precedent, if you don't, and the common law is unique in itself. And I think that's one of the benefits when you look at the Index of Economic Freedom. The countries or the jurisdictions that do well have actually embraced common law, and they're in the top 10. The countries that don't do not have that important rule of law and economic freedom.
Very good. I see another question here.
I have the same family name as Mara Letitsa, so we are relatives in a way. I had a minor role in establishing Croatian state. I was national security advisor to the first Croatian president, Tudjman. So I do appreciate what Adriatic Institute is doing, but being preoccupied with the dark side of reality and society, Natasha went too far. So I wouldn't like you to get impression that everything is negative in Croatia. I like Judge Saad's approach because he knows that his wife is a Croatian and she's a decent lady. So that is the majority of Croatians. So when speaking how to implement modern rule of law in Croatia, I wouldn't advocate importing judiciary culture from the United States, because there is also a dark side of the American judiciary. If you take only one indicator, that is a crime rate, it is 10 times higher in the United States than in Croatia, or 8 times higher in the United States compared to EU. So what I intend to say just that there are bright or positive side of Croatian reality, and comparing just 90s with 2014, we can say that we have made certain progress. As Natasha said, majority of grant or political corruption in Croatia is imported from neighboring countries. And she's right that due to American inhibitions and due to American reluctance to implement corruption methods, the American investors do have a problem investing in Croatia. All in all, I would say I would advocate another approach to developing judiciary in Croatia. It is also an American concept. It is called concept of usable past. So if we exclude 20th century of black and red totalitarian regimes, we do have our own judiciary and democratic tradition. And we can build a new Croatian judiciary tradition and new European free market economy on that usable Croatian and Balkan past. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your remarks. Let me just say, of course, if you've heard the Adriatic Institute present in other venues, there is a lot of focus on good that's going on there. And of course, the bottom line for all of us is people. I mean, we've talked about that in a number of things this morning. You have to have good people working together to create good government. But part of what we try to do here at Heritage is when we identify problems, transparency. We want people to understand the challenges that we face and that are faced in other parts of the world, because if you don't have this, if you don't shine a light on something, you can't get it fixed. So with that, let me turn it over to you for a response, and then we'll go down the line.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we just need to look at illicit financial outflows, for example, that were 15.2 billion to $50.2 billion in the period from 2001 to 2010, with much larger amounts that left the country between 1991 and 2001. If you look at the fact that $1.5 billion is leaving the country every year, that much Minister of Finance, Lini, just came in the States a month ago. He took a similar amount that annually leaves the country. So you see that the government is taking on a new debt so that the same amount of money can leave the country to tax corruption, tax evasion. People are taking on new debt that they don't need. They are paying more. No, sorry, no. They are paying higher taxes because they're just getting tax increase, and they are suffering. Do we have 22% unemployment in Croatia? 54% among the youth, based on UN report. So you see the situation that we have such corruption in the country that the budget is leaking out to tax evasion, corruption, and crime. On the other side, you have no new investments, because who's going to come to a country where you have to pay bribes at so many levels? You don't know how much is your investment going to cost you in the end. That's why we don't have new investments, so the budget is not getting filled up with the tax revenue. It's leaking on the other side. The budget deficit is 6% at this stage. 60% of debt is 60% of the GDP, I think, is debt. We have unemployment, as I mentioned, 22%, and growing. There's no way forward. We need to fix it. I mean, we need to fix it. We were talking the aspect of organized crime, the rule of law, for the sake of establishing normal democracy and market economy in Croatia. But when you talk to the people in Croatia, they are suffering. They are suffering. And it comes down to the rule of law and no protection of property rights.
Okay, Judge, and then Joel, you want to comment on this?
All right. I just wanted to mention, when we look at what's transpiring in Southeast Europe, and we just alluded to a brief moment about the EU enlargement program. Unfortunately, the EU enlargement program was deeply flawed. It just basically gave a checklist to countries saying, this is what we want you to do, and not to simplify the process, but of course, as Monica Macovei, the former justice minister, who was here at the Heritage Foundation from Romania, she mentioned at the cabinet meetings what people would do would say, well, we can certainly check off this list here. And as far as the implementation process was concerned, no one was really seriously focused on the implementation. Now, these issues would not be minor issues if you did not have the glaring concerns of about 1 million votes that were illegal voters on a list for a country of 4 million people. So while we criticize Russia, we have a nation, Croatia, with 1 million illegal votes, which is not only an EU member now, receiving taxpayer dollars from the EU, but also funding from the United States with the IMF and World Bank, as it will need in the days to come, but also the fact that this is hemorrhaging the economy and affecting people at the local level. And it's not just Croatia, it's Bosnia, it's Serbia, it's all these countries. And if we want these countries to be free, rule of law is important. We want them to be stable. Rule of law is important. And so I think that Richard Holbrook's statement comes back to this whole process, that we do need individuals of integrity. We do need individuals that deeply care about the lives of citizens, because it is, in effect, their responsibility, if they hold these offices, to make sure these precepts are advanced.
Well, thank you very much. That has to be the last word today. Let me remind all of you that Heritage does produce an index of economic freedom that covers some of these topics as important elements to having economic freedom in the world today. And of course, part of the reason, a main reason why we have programs like this is because we do deeply care about individuals around the world and what are the things that can be done to allow individuals to prosper in their own lives and with their own families. So thank you very much for attending. Those of you who are watching, thanks so much for being with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you at another day at another program at the Heritage Foundation. Let's thank our panelists once again.